Good news, good news. Good news, good news today.
No matter what else is happening in the world,
Always good news,
there is always good news today.
Welcome to Good News Today, the program where you'll always find good news no matter what else is happening in the world. I'm Mark Teske, your host for Good News Today. I want to thank you for joining us. We've got a great program today. For our devotional time, we'll be looking at John 13, 2 through 5. So get your Bibles, turn to John 13, and I'll meet you there. Troy Spradlin and Jim Dearman have prepared some thoughts for us, and Guyton Montgomery and Troy have an answer to a viewer's question. We're also reintroducing a segment that hasn't been on the program in over 10 years, and I know you're going to like it. We're in John chapter 13, beginning at verse number 2. And supper being ended, the devil having already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, and that he had come from God and was going to God, rose from supper and laid aside his garments, took a towel and girded himself. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded.
There's a message true and glad for the sinful and the sad. Ring it out, ring it out, ring it out, ring it out. It will give them courage new. It will help them to be true. Ring it out, ring it out, ring it out, ring it out. Ring out, merrily ring the word. Speed it away, for life, message divine, and see. Sing it today, still far from Jesus, here need live in sin. Lost and lost and doubt, darkness and doubt. Ring out, merrily ring the news, wonderful news that makes men free, happy and free. Through all the lost of every nation, ring the message out. Ring it out. Sin and doubt to sleep away till shall dawn the better day. Ring it out, ring it out, ring it out, ring it out, till the sinful world be won for Jehovah's mighty Son. Ring it out, ring it out, ring it out, ring it out, ring out, merrily ring the word. Speed it away, for life, message divine, unseen. Send it today, still far from Jesus, here need live in sin. Lost and lost and doubt, darkness and doubt. Ring out, merrily ring the news, wonderful news that makes men free, happy and free. Through all the lost of every nation, ring the message out, ring it out.
In John 13, Jesus is celebrating a Passover with his disciples in the upper room. He was about to be betrayed, arrested, and crucified. As we get to our text, the main part of the meal was already over. Turns out that they'd eaten their meal with dirty feet. Now, the washing of feet was a menial task. The lowliest servant, that was his job. None of the disciples had been willing to do it. Luke tells us in Luke 22, verse 24 and following, that the disciples were once again arguing about who is the greatest in the kingdom. There appears to have been a great humility problem in the room. Our text tells us that Jesus knew where he was from and where he was going. God himself in the flesh here on earth, by far better than any of them. Yet he humbled himself and washed their feet. That pales in comparison to what Jesus did when he humbled himself to come to the earth, Philippians 2, 5 through 8. But Jesus prepared himself as a servant and served. He didn't just talk, but he actually did it. We need to have Jesus' attitude toward service. Be willing to humble ourselves and serve. This lesson is at the heart of who Jesus is and what he has done. We can also see from this text Jesus' attitude toward Judas. He knew that Judas was about to betray him, yet he washed his feet anyways. What an example. We need to be willing to humble ourselves and to serve others. You know, in today's society, we value comfort over work. Not Jesus. He was willing to get on his knees and serve. So thankful that Jesus was willing to serve. He made this little sacrifice for them, but even a much greater sacrifice that evening into the next day, that we might have salvation. forgiveness of our sins. And that's good news for us today. Now, Troy Spradlin's in his workshop, and he's counting.
The Apostle John wrote, I have no greater joy than to hear my children walk in truth, in 3 John 4. And at the other end of that spectrum, the Apostle Paul wrote, For out of much affliction and anguish of heart I wrote to you with many tears, not that you should be grieved, but that you might know the love which I have so abundantly for you, in 2 Corinthians 2, verse 4. You know, these two apostles express what I believe so many Christian teachers have felt over the past 2,000 years. There is no feeling quite as exhilarating as witnessing a soul come to the acknowledgement of truth and then answering the gospel call. The same excitement is felt by teachers when a faithful child of God then blossoms and grows stronger in their faith. But in contrast, there is no heartache quite like the disappointment felt when a soul falters and eventually slips back into the darkness of the evil one. And you know, Jesus anticipated there would be those who would stumble in their faith. He understood that not everyone who becomes his disciple would remain a disciple. And in fact, he said, whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. And he went on to explain, for which of you intending to build a tower does not sit down first and count the cost? That's in Luke 14, 27 through 29. You see, what he's saying is, do not make this decision lightly or without first considering if you are willing to fully commit to it. Jesus even adds another metaphor about how kings know how to properly calculate and assess the seriousness of their decisions. So, to follow Jesus is a lifelong decision that will greatly impact your entire world. And it's not one to be made flippantly. It will cost you. So what does it mean to truly count the cost in following Jesus? Well, let's repair our understanding by considering a few of these points that I want to share with you. One, it means that you need to be engaging in your active prayer life in John 16, verse 23. A child of God must speak to his father, and the father wants to hear from his child. You see, it's impossible to maintain one's faith without prayer. Secondly, it means becoming a faithful worshiper of God, according to John 4, verse 24. One of the first things that seems to fall off for many new converts is their attendance to worship. But worship must be at the center of your Christian walk. Thirdly, it means choosing Jesus over worldly desires, according to Matthew 6, verse 33. You see, every decision we make must now consider our relationship with Jesus. If He is not at the center of our lives, then we risk being drawn away. It also means that you will suffer, according to Luke 6, verse 22. This is the part that really separates the sheep from the goats that we read about in passages like Matthew chapter 25. It means loyal perseverance, according to Revelation 2:10. You see, remaining faithful until death is the only way to receive the eternal reward that Jesus promises us. There's no second chances, and you have to make the decision right now. And it also means confessing Him before others, according to Matthew 10, verse 32. It means keeping His commandments, according to John 14:15. And it means becoming more like Him every day, according to Philippians 2, verse 5. You see, Jesus left us an example, and we must study and learn more about Him all the time so that we can be more like Him and less like the world. You see, there's a lot more to following Jesus than just saying you will and then getting baptized. There are real, tangible challenges that one must be willing to accept and meet. And it's not difficult to be a Christian, but it does require an earnest and genuine effort on the disciples' part. It requires one to count the cost of their decision to follow Jesus.
Thanks, Troy. After our break, Jim Dearman has some sound words.
You may have questions or comments about Good News Today. We'd like to hear from you. Or if you would like to receive free Bible study materials, please contact us. Our mailing address is Good News Today, P.O. Box 206, Dunlap, Tennessee 37327. Again, that's Good News Today, P.O. Box 206, Dunlap, Tennessee 37327. You may prefer to email us at goodnewstodaytv@gmail.com. That's goodnewstodaytv@gmail.com. Or call us toll free at 1-877-384-7221. That's 1-877-384-7221. We'd like to hear from you. Hearing from our audience is always good news to us.
We will live eternally if we obey sound words.
A certain critic approached a zealous church worker and said, "I believe in working for the church and in leading men to Christ, but I don't like your method very much." "Neither do I like my method very well," replied the worker. "How do you do it?" Confused, the man stammered, "Well, I don't know that I do it at all." "Then," said the worker, "I like the way I do it better than the way you don't do it." You know, God does not ask for more than we can deliver. How often, though, do we find ourselves not doing all we can for Him? The story is told of a lazy, slow-moving clerk in a small store. One morning, when he was not seen, a customer asked, "Is Ed sick today?" "Ed's not working here anymore," came the reply. "Got somebody in mind for the vacancy?" asked the customer. "Nope. When Ed quit, he didn't leave any vacancy." Will you leave a vacancy when you're gone? Are you doing the will of God or only just hearing His word?
We will live eternally if we obey sound words.
Thanks for those thoughts, Jim. Now it's time for a segment we haven't seen in many years, Fabric of Family with Barry Gilbert.
Let me ask you a question. Is it harder to parent a child today than, say, 40 or 50 years ago? What about raising a child today versus 2,000 years ago? You know, every generation has their parenting challenges. As parents, we seek to raise our children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, but, you know, that's easier said than done, isn't it? Especially is it difficult when worldliness is unashamedly paraded before our kids everywhere they go. Whether you're taking your family to the mall or ball field, to the school, or even what is supposed to be a family-friendly amusement park, the devil and his agents of destruction, they're going to be there also. Of course, there is the internet and computers and cell phones, which have all become a convenient tool for his propaganda. Satan seeks to chip away the moral integrity of your family wherever your kids may roam, in the schoolroom, the classroom, and even their own bedroom. Satan will do his dead-level best to undermine their faith and moral purity. And you know, in some ways, things have not really changed with the passing of time. In the day of the Apostle Paul, parents walking with their children in the city of Corinth would have been exposed to the sights that would have even made a sailor to blush, as we sometimes say. It was all around them. Everywhere they went, ungodliness paraded itself. And in some ways, what our children might see today might even be a little tame in comparison to some of the public sites in Corinth. If we had lived during the time of the Roman Empire, we would see sexual perversion and sin incorporated into things such as art and theater and music, governmental decrees, and even in the worship of their many pagan gods. Imagine driving with your children through the downtown area of your location and seeing prostitutes, both male and female, not just in a sketchy part of town, but right on Main Street, soliciting those who pass by to engage in sexual deviancy right on the steps of the pagan church building. Well, that's what early parents would have faced during the first century. Now, certainly we recognize that there have been particular times through the years in which parents have had some extraordinary challenges. I think we may be living in one of those times right now. But we can rest assured that parents in any generation, you know, it's never going to be a piece of cake. When you take into consideration that you're dealing with a child who has the potential for imperfection, coupled with the fact that that child has been given free will by God, it would be true that every generation of parents have potentially faced extremely difficult circumstances. As godly parents examine the moral fabric of our nation today, it is not difficult to see that there is an ethical storm that's raging around us. The winds of change are blowing very hard these days. The godly values that American families once stood for are now being taken away by those in positions of power. Moral precepts that were once assumed to be permanent are no longer shared and celebrated in our nation. Standards of right and wrong are now being challenged openly and persistently. Tolerance of evil is now seen as a virtue, and intolerance of wickedness is seen as a vice. Moral confusion is being pushed and propagated on our children by politicians, entertainers, educators, corporations, and even religious institutions. Though parenting has never been easy, it is certainly becoming more complicated in our generation. All of these influences have certainly compounded our challenges that we face in raising godly children today. Now, don't get me wrong. Immorality and ungodliness, they've always been around. It began in the early history of man in the book of Genesis, and it continues even unto this day. Though the product of sin is still the same, the packaging has changed. It used to be that if a person wanted to view sexually explicit material, they'd have to walk into a convenience store and have the courage to ask for those materials that would be kept behind the counter. Today, the counter is simply a cell phone or maybe a laptop, and everybody has one. The end result is that the world is changing, and it's not changing for the better. So what is a parent to do? How can a parent face these unique challenges that we're facing in these troubling times? Well, what I'd like to do is suggest a few things that can help us as parents rise to the occasion. First of all, parents need to get their minds right. Now, what I mean is as parents, we don't need to allow the world to influence how we think. One of the ploys of the change agent movement is to get us to adopt the thinking that truth is, well, it's relevant, it's always changing, it's never going to be absolute. You see, they want you to embrace the idea that what you hold as truth may not necessarily be truth for someone else. So don't speak up. Don't voice your concerns, they would say. Don't speak out against something such as marriage being just for a man and a woman. Don't say anything in opposition to those who would claim that a boy can become a girl or a girl can become a boy. Now, of course, they're going to make sure that their voices are heard in our schools and through celebrities and entertainment and media, but don't you speak out and let your voice be heard. Parents, we need to get our minds right. But secondly, here's something else. We need to stay strong in our godly values. In other words, don't let the world melt you into their mold. The world wants you to submit to their standards. They want you to bow the knee to the current worldly fad of the day. Resist the temptation to fall in line with those who are set on the destruction of Judeo-Christian values. Listen, everyone in your community might bow the knee to Baal, but don't you do it. You be like the prophet Daniel, who would not bow to the political powers of his day. Be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know, over in the Bible, in Daniel chapter 3, verse 16, we read, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we're not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Parents, be strong, because your kids are dependent upon your leadership. Thirdly, As a parent, be vocal. Go to the PTA meetings, go to the county meetings, the city meetings, attend those public gatherings that are addressing the matters involving your children, and speak up. You know, there's a big push to try and silence anyone who does not go along with the immoral agenda of some. Don't be intimidated. You see, they want you to be silent. So do the opposite and be vocal. Be vocal for godly values. And then lastly, teach your children the difference between right and wrong. Talk with your children about the issues that they are being confronted with at school and in the media. Now, I know that these topics may sometimes make us a little uncomfortable discussing with our children. But you know, as a godly parent, we don't really have a choice. There are certain cultural trends that are sweeping across this nation, and whether we like it or not, our children are being exposed to these vices. And if they're only getting the world's distortion of right and wrong, and we're not out there to offer the bigger picture and to provide that godly instruction in matters that they are thinking about, why would we be surprised when our kids start reasoning like the world and embracing the world? And so it is important that we as parents communicate with our kids.
Thanks, Barry. In just a moment, we'll give our Bible question to Guyton and Troy. Now we have a Bible question for Guyton and Troy. I suffer from depression. Since Jesus told us, do not be troubled, is my depression a sin?
Troy, do you ever get sad?
I do get sad sometimes, Guyton.
Do you ever get a little depressed?
Well, it just depends on what's happening in my life, but I suppose, yes.
You know, I do too, and I think it's important before we start this question. I normally put something funny at the beginning. I want to use the opportunity to just say that depression and clinical depression is very real. And I realize if you're watching this show right now that maybe you're struggling through some of that, but I want you to know that there is hope and there are ways to resolve that. And if you ever you're struggling with that, reach out through our program and get in contact with us so that we can try and help you with whatever it is that you are facing. But the question that came in is, I suffer from depression. Since Jesus told us, do not be troubled, is my depression a sin? And so I want to answer that very specifically with a very clear answer, is that someone suffering from depression, it doesn't mean that you're in sin. And in fact, by this specific verse, John chapter 14, verse 1, that's actually really not the context of what he is talking about. And there are other passages that we can talk about dealing with depression, but John 14, verse 1 is actually very specific about an event that's about to take place.
Yes, in fact, Jesus is on his way over to the Garden of Gethsemane, and the disciples are concerned about what's happening, and they're not understanding because, you know, we have hindsight vision to be able to look back and see what's happening. They didn't. And so he said, don't let your heart be troubled. And then he says, I go to prepare a place for you, and those sort of things.
Back up to verse 37 of chapter 13. Peter said unto him, Lord, why cannot I follow thee now? I'll lay down my life for your sake. And so you see his urgency, his desire to go with him. And Jesus has already told him, you can't follow me. And so
not where I'm going.
So chapter 14, verse 1, he's saying, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. And what a beautiful verse. We got to read it. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. If I go to prepare a place, I'll come again. And so what he's telling them is, don't be troubled because we're about to separate. This separation is just something temporary. And I've got a place for you that you will one day be.
Yes, and for those that are suffering from depression, I want you to know that the scriptures also are the place of comfort. I mean, 1 Corinthians 1:3 tells us that God is a God of all comfort. We also know that we can cast all of our burdens on Jesus. He says that in Matthew 11, verse 28. We've got other versions or other verses that we could go to, like 1 Peter 5, that tells us to cast all our burdens on him. The only time that something like depression or anything turns into a sin is whenever you take everything out of God's hands. Whenever you start worrying, just like Jesus says in Luke chapter 12, verse 25, he says, and which of you by worrying can add 1 cubit to his stature? Worry and depression are not necessarily the same thing. They're very separate.
They are. And one of the things I like to remember is that even great men of faith were depressed. They worried and struggled at times.
Elijah.
That's exactly where I was going to go. Under the juniper tree, he was ready. He was just, God, let me die now. And so he was at a state of depression at that point, and it wasn't sin. That was that human weakness. Now, will Satan use depression to try and tear you away from God?
He sure will.
He will. And that's why we need to turn to scriptures, sometimes good biblical counseling, sometimes getting to a doctor to find out is the depression being caused because of hormonal or vitamin imbalances. And that's why I'm saying if you're suffering from it, please reach out to us and we can help you biblically and point you in the right direction medically. But John chapter 14 isn't dealing with depression. John chapter 14 is dealing with they were worried about being without Jesus. But they needed to understand that they're never without Jesus Christ because he hears, he sees everything. He's ruling over his kingdom today, and he's at the right hand of God right now, preparing a place that one day we can be with him eternally in the presence of God.
Amen.
Let me reiterate what they just told you. If you're suffering with depression, get some help. If we can help you in that, let us know. We encourage you to check what we've taught or what anybody teaches in religious matters against the Word of God. Remember, you can listen to our program again through our website, our apps, or our podcast. Contact us for a free Bible course. Remember that we love you, we're praying for you, and we want you to make it to heaven.
Always good news, good news, good news. There is good news today. There is good news around the world. Always good news, good news, good news. There is good news today. All around the world. Good news around the world. Always good news, good news, good news. There is good news today.